Good evening, everyone. My name is Sunil Mehta, and I'm the Chairman and Managing Director of SPM Capital Advisors. I'm also a founding board member of the Asia Society India Center. The Asia Society has taken advantage of this entire lockdown and has done about 600 programs during this period, including some very interesting discussions on food security, public health, and world politics. They are all available on our YouTube page, so do go ahead and view these webinars whenever you have the time. We're all together this evening to talk about Indian media, which is witnessing a transformational shift from traditional mediums to new age platforms, mainly digital, that are just a click away. While I was sort of thinking about the entire event this evening, I thought about a brief anecdote, which is about 38 years ago, when I applied for a job at Citibank. I asked one of the Citibanker friends, what should I do to prepare for the interview? And this kind-hearted soul said, you've got 2 weeks, just read Times of India and Economic Times, cover to cover, and you'll be fine. And so I religiously did that. And 2 weeks later, when I was going through my different rounds of interviews, at the 14th round, there was a contentious discussion on what is the capacity utilization of the Indian power plants. And this was the most crucial person who was taking my final interview, and his figure was different to mine. I finally said to him that the current capacity utilization is X. I don't recall whether it was 64 or 65%. He contested, but I said this figure is from the editorial of the Economic Times on such and such date. He listened to me carefully, perhaps conceded, and I did get an appointment letter with Citibank. And I thought to myself, what really worked? It was the credibility of a newspaper that I finally sort of got the better of my 14th interview and the round there. The information that I gathered from the newspapers. And more importantly, I figured that even they were reading only those two papers that I was. And that was really the universe of media at that point of time. The world has changed since then. As news has become more accessible, news production more competitive, digital platforms are trying to outperform traditional players in reportage and in reach. This ubiquity of news has also brought with itself a serious challenge of misinformation. The changing discourse of the sector's demands for an overhaul of the existing press regulatory structures and legal frameworks as well. Additionally, an action plan to study and unclog complex media ownership patterns and limit external influences on objective reportage will help strengthen press freedom. There are lots of issues that the Indian media is facing today, and we are seeing so many more developments that have happened both on what is being witnessed on the print, electronic, and digital media, the whole credibility of what is real news and fake news, the aspects relating to is there enough self-regulation on the news that is being disseminated, and of course, how much is the intervention that we are seeing of the entire political system or the regulators, as the case may be. I think we couldn't have found 4 better individuals than what we have on our screens this evening for a discussion on this important subject. Just a brief introduction, though all of them do not need any introduction, but just to sort of cover what all they are doing. Sanjaya is a distinguished fellow, Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, and United Service Institution of India. He has been editor of India's major financial news, The Economic Times, Financial Express, and Business Standard, amongst his other achievements. Madhu Trehan is the co-founder and former editor-in-chief of the digital media portal Newslaundry. Madhu has been the founding editor of India Today magazine and has several years of experience in journalism. James Crabtree is a Singapore-based author and journalist and associate professor of practice at the Kuan School of Public Policy. His best-selling book, The Billionaire Raj, was shortlisted for the FT McKinsey Book of the Year. Shereen Bhan is the managing editor of the leading business TV news channel CNBC TV 18. Ms. Bhan has more than 2 decades of experience in journalism and has anchored and produced several shows. As we sort of move into the discussion and Shereen takes over, a bit of housekeeping. All those who are joining us on Zoom, please leave your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. For our audience on Facebook, please drop them in the comments section. I would now invite Shereen to take over. Shereen, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mehta, for the opportunity, and thank you to the Asia Society for putting this panel together. I'm hoping that this is going to be an engaging session. I know that my panelists are not going to hold back, so this promises to be a very exciting session. I think, you know, if you could broadly sort of put into buckets the many challenges that not just Indian media, but media in general face, and I think Indian media has some specific or unique issues and challenges that we're facing. But I think in general, if I could sort of put them into buckets, I would think that one, of course, is the existential bucket. And I think that is an issue that traditional media, print, largely is facing. I mean, what is the future in terms of monetization? What do you do with declining readership? How do you morph yourself into a digital brand, a journey that something like the New York Times has been able to do very, very successfully? So I think those are issues of the existential kind that a lot of the traditional and legacy media are going to have to deal with. I think there is a broad crisis of credibility challenge. And I think that, without sort of making sweeping generalizations, I think is largely more a TV news problem and more a TV general news problem in India today. And I think that will have its own sort of implications on how this is going to play out, which leads us to the third challenge, which is now becoming increasingly clear. It is going to be a reality of a new regulatory regime. In fact, the Supreme Court in India just this afternoon has asked the government to come back and give details on a new regulatory regime that will govern television channels and perhaps online media as well, which will be based on a statute. And that is something that I would imagine the government is also working on. So it's not a regulatory crisis yet, but it certainly is a challenge, and we don't know how this is going to shape up as we move forward. There are, of course, issues with corporatization of ownership, corporatization of the media. That brings about its own set of challenges, the commoditization of news, the homogenization of news. And I think one of the, since this session is about introspection, I think one of the issues that each one of us as media professionals, as custodians of media brands, will need to think about is, as any consumer service, who are we relevant to today? Are we really relevant to our readers, to our viewers, or are we relevant to owners and the establishment? And I think this will lead back to then the existential question as well. And I think that soul searching has to be done in a much more rigorous fashion. in newsrooms today. And I don't believe that enough of that is going on. So I think these are going to have to be issues that we deal with in the course of this session. Fortunately for my panel, I'm not the sort of anchor who loves the sound of my voice. I don't believe that I know everything or I'm an expert on anything. And I will not press the mute button if I don't like what I hear. So without further ado, let me hand over the reins to Sanjay Baru for quick introductory comments from each of our panelists, and then we'll get right down to the questions. And please do keep your questions coming in. We want to make this as interactive and engaging as possible. Dr. Baru.
Thank you, Shereen, and thank you to Asia Society. I'm a print guy. I've spent my professional media life in print. I'm not familiar with television, or certainly not familiar with social media. Print, I agree, Shereen said about the challenge print is facing from electronic media. But I think in India, we must make a distinction between English print and Indian language print. The readership for Indian language media, print media, is still increasing. As literacy rates go up, more and more Indians are in fact accessing news from newspapers. So the crisis is not so much in Indian language print media as it is in English language print media. But even English language print media, I think, benefits from the fact, as you just mentioned, Shereen, that television is going in a direction, it's becoming more of entertainment than of news. I mean, TV channels are competing with other entertainment channels. We hardly get any news from television. It's either controversy or argument or sheer entertainment, if you would like to call it that. So as a print person, I think the major credibility issue, in my view, is the loss of editorial control in many papers, not all of them. In fact, you can actually draw a graph and show that the more credible media organizations are the ones which have better editorial control. I'm conservative when it comes to editorial control. I believe editorship and editorial control is fundamental to the credibility of media. And print, which has good editors as leaders, remains credible. I'm glad Sunil made the point about the credibility of the Economic Times, one of my former newspapers. I think the financial media is still editor-led media. Not all newspapers are editor-led. And certainly in television, I don't know who operates the editorial control. We see virtual anarchy on television. So on the first question of credibility, I still think that print is the most credible medium, despite the competition it gets from television, despite the competition it gets from social media. Social media is no media. I don't regard social media as a source of credible information. There's far more fake news on social media than there is news. So at the end of the day, print remains an important institution within media, despite the challenges it faces. It is facing financial challenges because of declining advertising, which is going more into television, and also in general declining investment in media. The second point I'll make purely as introductory remark is that, it's not just the credibility of media that I'm worried about today, as much as I'm worried about the credibility of regulation. I think we are now living in a situation in India where any talk of government regulation or government interference is highly suspect. I'm not completely opposed to some broad principles of functioning, of professional conduct, etc. But I think we are in a phase where the credibility of regulatory institutions, in general regulatory institutions, but in particular media regulatory institutions, is suspect. And therefore, I am worried about regulation. Let me stop with those initial remarks and we can continue our conversation.
Well, important points made there by Dr. Baru, and important questions as well. When you talk about a loss of editorial control, who's responsible for the loss of editorial control, or why have we seen that come to pass? When you talk about social media and you virtually dismissed it as a source of credible information, yet you see newsrooms, and it's not just here in India, but globally as well, being dictated by what I call, for the lack of a better term, hashtag journalism. And we're seeing that play out here as well. So, what's the road ahead when we talk about that? And the credibility of regulation also begs the question of whether there has been a good enough job done by organizations that were set up to regulate media. I mean, you have the Press Council, you have many organizations, the News Broadcasters Association, and so on and so forth. And have they not been able to effectively do their job, which is why we're at the situation where we're now talking about, in the words of the Information and Broadcasting Minister, he said over the weekend that press freedom cannot be limitless. So what kind of limits are now going to be imposed? I think those are going to have to be important questions that we will grapple with. But Madhu Trehan, let me come to you. I have to say that Madhu was one of the reasons why I fell in love with broadcast journalism. I grew up watching News Track, and we will talk about the need for mentorship. And I have to say, I didn't know her then, but to me, she was a mentor because I enjoyed watching what she did. And so, Madhu, over to you.
Thank you, Shereen, and hi, Sanjay. Nice to see you again. Hi, James. We haven't met, so good to meet you. I don't have this sort of competitive thing about print, television, internet, because I started in print, went on to, as you know, television, investigative journalism on video, and then on television, and now on the digital media. I'm comfortable with all of them. I don't see them as one killing the other. I don't see any of that in terms of functioning journalism. I think people are doing all kinds of journalism on all these media, and you can't dismiss the social media because of the medium itself. All right. So if they're doing pornography on video, you can't say all video is bad. You can't say, if they're doing pornography, you understand what I'm saying. So I don't think one should dismiss the medium. There's some good journalism being done in print as well as television and in the digital media. And there's also a lot of garbage. So one has to be able to, I trust readers and viewers to be able to sift that. The other issue which I do want to address is Sanjay, were talking about editorial control. Now, in our country, and I know in many other countries also, the editorial control is extremely subtle. In India, all the controls are done in a subterranean way, with subtle messages, with subtle threats. And we face that not only from the time I started in journalism, whichever government was in power. And we face those kind of attempts at control and how we resist them or resisted them then, and how they can be resisted even now. So I wouldn't blame this government alone, but there is a constant struggle of trying to suppress anything that makes people in power uncomfortable. And editors are then given messages which they have a choice of either to listen to or not, or whatever. So these are issues that are very real. We cannot say that there is complete editorial freedom anywhere, because one has to weigh the pros and cons of the price one will have to pay. And this has always been the case, as far as I know, in India, since I started working. There is a price to pay. If you do something that can be damaging to whether it's a politician or even a businessman, you know of stories where how business withdraws advertising from a news channel if an unflattering report has been published or broadcast. So that's one issue. Right now, I think we have the real issue of polarization, in which from the time I started journalism, it was very carefully couched. There was an attempt to neutrality. You gave both sides. I mean, there's no question of objectivity, but you always waited for the other side. Today, as you know, I know James Crabtree wrote his book when Arnab Goswami was just starting. I would really like to see what his opinion would be. What would he write about that form of genre of so-called journalism now, after all that has happened in the last month? That I have to make one very strong comment on, that you cannot use journalism as a disguise for propaganda. It is like a doctor putting on a white coat or his operating blues, going into an operating room and saying, I'm going to save this patient, I'm going to do surgery, and pretend to be a doctor, and then seriously damage the patient. And he's allowed to do it because he is pretending to be a doctor. So you can't pretend to be a journalist, do propaganda, damage the profession, damage all credibility, and say, I can do it because I'm a journalist. But are you? Are you a journalist? At that point, I have a question that there has to be some kind of, I'm not saying regulatory diktats, but I am saying that there has to be from the viewers themselves, that they have to see that what they're watching is propaganda. Is it journalism? We have to raise those questions. So you can't take the cloak of journalism, do propaganda, and then say it's brand everyone who disagrees with you as anti-national. Those kind of judgments, jury, and ordering the CBI that they're accountable to a person in a studio, I don't think that is journalism. Where are the stories? So I think we're in serious trouble in that. And I have some more points, but I think I've taken up too much time. So I will wait for other people to talk, and then I'll talk about the other things which I want to talk about, which is how the young journalists are being misguided into the worst kind of journalism.
Very important points. Madhu Trehan, you won the Twitter poll. James Crabtree had a Twitter poll running. Who was going to name Arnab first? And so you've got that. James, over to you.
What do I get? I want a free copy of James's book.
I was going to mention that. Yeah, you get to go on Arnab's show and get harangued. That's your prize.
Thank you. I look forward to that.
Very good.
Let me get my helmet.
We can perhaps talk about Arnab a little bit later. I'm very happy to reflect on that. I mean, so let me try and sort of give a minor note of optimism, very heavily qualified. So when I lived in India for 5 years in Mumbai for the Financial Times, and I moved to Singapore, where I'm speaking to you from now, and to write the book that Madhu kindly mentioned. And so when I used to come back to India or give talks about the media elsewhere around Asia, I used to say, okay, the Indian media ecosystem has all sorts of problems, and I detail some of them in a chapter in my book, but also, you know, it has various very good points. And so you compare, for instance, the media in Singapore to India, and the kind of media that I remembered from my time in Mumbai looked reasonably favorable. In the sense that at least you had a kind of fearsome, relatively diverse media ecosystem. It was certainly more interesting to read than the kind of extremely cautious, cowed media that you get, not just in Singapore, but in many, many other countries in Eastern Asia. And so that was my sort of note of optimism, trying to kind of be nice to the Indian media ecosystem. And I suppose as I've watched from afar, I've found it harder and harder to justify that view. It's true still that if you look at the Reporters Without Borders ranking, India is still slightly more free than Singapore, but not by much. It's kind of catching up. So I think India is down to about 145 and Singapore is something like 155, 154. And India is falling. It's also falling on the internet freedom ranking as well. And so across there's a range of reasons underlying that we'll go into, from, you know, the specifics of what happened in Kashmir to threats of regulation to political interference. I mean, I suppose if I would point to two things that alarm me about the direction of Indian media, some of which have already been touched on. One is the kind of the all-encompassing problem of partisanship. That's partially to do with the tenor of the television news channels, which get an awful lot of attention, but it's a much broader problem about the way that the Indian social media ecosystem works in particular. And to that extent, I think it's partly a technological change, but it also reflects a deeper undercurrent in Indian society. The way politics has been moving over the last 5 or 10 years has deepened divisions within the country, and media both reflects and exacerbates that. So that's one problem. And I'm not really sure what you do about that. It's in both respects very complicated to think, how do you de-escalate what's happening on television news when it's clear that kind of viewers and money follows the sensationalism. But equally, what on earth do you do about the social media ecosystem? This isn't a problem that's at all unique to India. I mean, Indian Twitter is particularly poisonous, but it's true in Myanmar, it's true in all sorts of places around Asia, that the kind of social media ecosystem is proving to be democratically very problematic. So that's one. And then the second one is a kind of crisis of public service journalism, which is really about business models. So I'm much more pessimistic than Sanjaya is about the long-term viability of the business models of the heritage print media, because I've seen what happens in the West when you run slap bang into the kind of digital media tornado. And the problem, it seems to me, is that in the West, you've got now a kind of bifurcated media system where you have an elite tier at the top, the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, they're all the Bloomberg, they're all doing very well through a combination of rich owners and rich customers. The problem is I don't see the emergence of that creamy layer in India. You know, most of the heritage media, with the exception of the Times of India group, which is in itself problematic in some respects, are, I think, living on borrowed times in terms of their business model. And you don't even have the heritage that you had in some of the richer countries of having, you know, the stuff that's really gone to the wall in the West, that kind of middle tier of city papers that were doing good investigative journalism that have fallen by the wayside. And so I think that, you know, that's another real cluster of problems about the long-term viability of the heritage print press, but also the lack of anything approaching a kind of public service mainstream that you have in many other countries that provide you with this kind of bedrock of fact-based impartial journalism that then kind of anchors the whole system. So those are I think two reasons to be pessimistic, and why my sometimes more optimistic view seems to be, to my mind, kind of getting harder to defend.
Well, you know, I think you've raised some important issues, James, and I think we do need to acknowledge that there are no easy answers for many of the questions that you have raised. But since all three of you talked about regulation, and I think that is going to have to be you know, an issue that we address immediately, because I think that over the next few weeks, we are going to see fast-moving developments on that front. And Madhu, I want to come back to you, because you said, look, if people, and if you go by ratings, pre-rigging, and so on and so forth, that's the only sort of barometer that you can use to judge these things, then people are watching that kind of journalism. So as the government looks at what it should do in terms of regulation, if the Supreme Court is essentially saying that, look, these self-regulating bodies that you've got in place are not doing their job effectively and we need a change, then what sort of change do you believe is going to be palatable? What will be acceptable? What should be acceptable?
Shereen, there are one or two points. You mentioned the ratings. And as you know, there was this exposure of payoffs made to people who are given the set-top boxes. The other problem is, in the millions that are watching who have a television in their households, you have 40,000 people who are being monitored, and their ratings are going to decide what they're watching. So all that is questionable. We really actually do not know what the people, the millions, I think it's 2 million people, I don't know nobody knows what they're really watching. So we're presuming that the noisy, the propagandist, the one-sided, the sensationalist, people are watching that. Are we sure? I really am not sure on that, because that whole scam showed that there were payoffs, for one thing. And if they were being watched, why did they pay them off? If they were so successful, then the scam exposed that they weren't that successful. So there really has to be an investigation on BARC, which has now at this moment stopped rating anybody. And I think that's a good thing, because we're really in a space where we don't know who is, and we presume that, oh yes, people are watching sensational stuff. Do we really know? Are we sure? My feeling is that people are watching serious news also. Very often people are actually turning to Doordarshan to get news when there's too much of sensational stuff. So that's one point. So I don't see how we can presume when all of that has been discredited. Secondly, James brought up something about public service. Now, I was in a discussion on another I discovered that there are young people who actually, and I promise you this is true, who actually are unaware of the fact that journalism is supposed to be a public service. They didn't even know about it. It was a concept that was alien to them. They thought it's a money-making thing. So our young people presume that they don't know that it's a public service. And I believe that there are certain professions which are public, such as medicine, the legal profession, teaching, journalism, that if you do it well and you make good money, that's great. But if your decisions are taken on the basis of only profit, then you're no longer in public service, and that damages the profession in any of these professions. So that is one of the serious things. And one example that I'll give you is that I was watching an interview where a young girl was interviewing someone about Riya Chakravarti. And I was shocked that this young reporter was asking this woman, saying, so tell me why is Riya Chakravarti running away from a media trial? Why doesn't she face us for the media trial? Now look at the concept that these young people actually believe that a media trial is okay. Look how warped the thinking has become. And we are responsible. We're allowing this misconception of what journalism is to dictate the worst kind of perpetration of, I wouldn't call it false news, of just distracting people from the real issues. We have so many serious real issues. And you, Shereen, you of all people on your channel know what those issues are. But are those issues being addressed by journalism today? I ask you, are they satisfactorily being addressed? The issues that India is facing? No, because they're being distracted with all these, silly things, trivia. So this is one of the problems that I think that unless we get a real, with some credibility, who is watching what, we can't presume that these propagandist channels are actually successful. I'm not so sure. Have you met anyone who praises them? Even on Twitter, look at Twitter. There are enough people trashing them. So I don't know that, I question people claim such success.
Well, yes, the TRP scam, the alleged TRP scam, it is a matter still under investigation, so I'll stick with that, but has shown that there have been payoffs, and this is not new. We've seen this happen previously as well in India, and the manipulation of these people meters, as they were called then, has been something that has been sort of an open secret that the Indian media news industry, not so much the entertainment channels, but the news industry has come to live with. But on the larger issue of regulation, Dr. Baru, I want to address that issue to you now, because as I pointed out, we are going to see some changes emerge over the next few weeks. What do you believe should be the way forward? I mean, how do you get the balance? Because clearly, what the courts are saying, what the government is saying is, we need to intervene, and we will now intervene. So, what do you believe should the way forward be?
Let me return to the point I began with, which is editorial control. I do believe that if young journalists don't know what their profession is all about, the fault lies with their editors, or the fault lies with the fact that there are no editors. You have many credible media platforms today with very good editorial control doing an excellent job. I mean, I can mention names. You take a website like The Wire or The Print. There are newspapers like the Business Standard, The Hindu. There are credible media organizations in Indian language media particularly, where editors play an important role in training young people, in setting standards, in regulating conduct, etc. So I do think that when you get good editorial control, you will get self-regulation. There was, about 20 years back when I was editor of the Financial Express, SEBI called a meeting of all editors. Almost all the editors in the country were invited for a meeting where the Securities and Exchange Board of India said that SEBI will regulate media because they found that many journalists were using their positions in the media to make money. And there was a lot of insider trading going on, particularly in the business TV channels. All of us objected to that. The head of SEBI at that time, I think it was Mr. Bajpai, G.N. Bajpai, said to us, look guys, I don't want to do this job if you guys do your own job. If you as editors can ensure that there is no corruption within your organization, that reporting is authentic, that professional standards are maintained, then there is no need for an outside agency. And at that particular round table, there were about 30 or 40 editors around the table. We all promised him that we will actually ensure those standards. One of the promises we made was that we will all have codes of conduct, and that these codes of conduct would be published. They would be put up on websites. I was then the editor of the Financial Express. We worked out a code of conduct. We put it on our website. We circulated it to every single member of the organization. I know many other organizations also did that. Question you can ask today is, how many media organizations have a code of conduct? If you had a code of conduct, a lot of the problems that Madhu referred to would not be there, because it would contravene the code of conduct. What is the role of an anchor on a television channel? What should he be doing? What should he not be doing? Do we have codes of conduct? Do we have professional codes of conduct? I mean, every profession has
that is, to Madhu's point, that has now become the norm. That has become the accepted code of conduct. That's the problem.
That is not the professional norm, right? I mean, that is not the accepted code of conduct. That is behavior which is not acceptable by a professional journalist. And every profession has a code of conduct. I mean, you expect when you get into an aeroplane, you know exactly what the pilot's job is. So when you pick up a newspaper, you'd like to know what exactly was the editor's job in producing that newspaper. Or when you have a television channel, you'd like to know how news was selected, how views were apportioned. So I do think that editorial control, professional control is important, even to address the problem of training of young people. That a large part of the training is internal. It's within the organization. So I have been a strong advocate of good editors, of professional editors, of editorial organizations like Editors Guild of India playing a much more assertive and active role in setting these codes of conduct. And it is the lack of these codes of conduct that allows governments to intervene. When just as a SEBI example, today if the government is saying, I will come in and set a code of conduct, it is taking advantage of the fact that media does not itself have a code of conduct. And I do not trust any governmental interference. Forget about which political party is in power. As a journalist, I will not accept any regulation or any code of conduct defined by bureaucrats or politicians sitting in. That is not democracy, and that is not acceptable. But having said that, I think we have to look inwards within the profession and ask ourselves, what are the codes of conduct? When you go away from these big names, which we've been talking about, particularly the kind of English language media, and you go to the rest of the country, which we often do not talk about.
Yes.
Many of them do not have editors. The owner is the editor, and the owner is often a politician. Almost a large majority of Indian language publications are owned by politicians. And in fact, if you look at the print line, they are the editors, but they don't have time of the day to even look at the newspaper that is being produced in their name. So I do think that as a profession, we need to go back to asking the question, what is the role of professional conduct, of editorial control, and how do we restore credibility of the profession? That is a crisis in the media today.
Yes, that certainly is a crisis. And, let's address that with you, James. One of the other problems that we're seeing, and not just here in India, but globally, I mean, President Trump has made CNN the butt of jokes and accusations for as long as he's been in office. And we're seeing that play out not just in the US or in India, but across the world, with this constant battering of traditional media, discrediting traditional media, branding them as fake news, etc. And that also evokes a certain response from consumers of that media. What challenge is that throwing up now, James? And how do you reclaim this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting balance, isn't it? On the one hand, you do see this problem of populist politicians going after the traditional so-called liberal media, but you also see their governments going after new media as well. And so that seems to be what's happening in India. I mean, I haven't followed this as closely as I suspect you have, Shereen, but what you see in many jurisdictions is governments that want to bring the press to heel using new media as the reason for bringing in regulation. So they're critical of the old media and they say that they're very biased. But when they actually get the rule book out, what they're looking for is an excuse to try and bring parts of the new media ecosystem under the same sort of control. So that seems to be what's happening in India. And I mean, my understanding is this starts with Amazon and Netflix and the risk that you might have certain types of programming which are brought under stricter controls, for instance, those that might be offensive to religious sensibilities. But the real worry, something that Madhu talked about, I think, is the independent news websites, which are in many ways the kind of most spirited, the kind of inheritors of that rather more buccaneering Indian media tradition. And the risk is that using justifications from fake news to what have you, that the kind of heavy hand of the law is used on these kind of sites, the ones that Sanjaya mentioned, the Wire, the Print, this sort of thing. And you know, in the end, these are not terribly well-funded organizations, and they're already tied up in legal disputes. And as somebody who's been the victim of an Indian legal dispute myself with one of your billionaires, I can attest to how painful that is. So yeah, so I mean, the question you asked about regulation more broadly, I think this is a rather alarming trend. I don't think anyone should be of the view that the online sphere should be regulation free. There are all sorts of ways in which the social media platforms in particular need to be made accountable, democratically accountable for the incredibly powerful role that they play in the public square. That's also true increasingly of a company like Reliance Jio, which has enormous power, much more power than any normal traditional newspaper, much more power than Republic or anything like that, if you look at where the media ecosystem is going. So there is a role for regulation in many different respects, but I suspect the problem is that the regulation will come and be focused in the wrong place.
Yes, Madhu, how worried are you today? As somebody who's running Newslaundry, how worried are you?
I'm not actually running Newslaundry anymore. I'm independent. And when I say that, when I say I'm independent, I think that answers your question, if you know what I mean. All right. The thing is that I don't know why they have to put in more regulations or bring in more this thing, because already there are enough rules and regulations which can be used in many different forms, in any different way. And it has been done through generations since 1960, 70, 80, and is continuing to be done. And I don't see why they think that they need more regulations, because whatever you need to do, they do anyway, if they try to control someone. The second thing is that with the internet, either you decide you're going to be China, and because in India, we don't want to admit that we want to take our controls as extreme as China, because we are a democratic free country, ostensibly, then how are we going to control it the way the Chinese government controls it, but still appear as a democracy? That is, I think that's where the government is stuck now. They would like to control it, but how? How do you control the internet? It's not a simple thing. It's not the same as print and television. So I'd like to see how what acrobatics they do. It'd be interesting to watch. How are they going to control us? Okay, I welcome they can put chips in our brain and control our thoughts. It'll be fun to see what they do. I'd like to hear them. I'd like them to know what my thoughts are. Maybe it'll confuse them and upset them so much that the regulations may stop. But without being funny, I think the serious part is that there are, as you know, as Sanjay, my friend Sanjay knows, there are enough regulations already. And when Sanjay spoke about good editors, he actually took me back nostalgically, because those were the days when there were good editors. The pressures today are far more complex, far more difficult for editors to find. Each decision is not as simple as, is this a good is this good journalism? The implications are far more deep and sometimes permanent. So it's much more complicated to be an editor today in India. And as far as the regulations, somebody should explain to me, how are they not able to do whatever they want to do anyway? There are enough regulations, and it's not going to make what you see on television and the internet, where completely, absolute offensive, sensational garbage is either written and full of lies. I think it's more important to make news organizations accountable rather than regulated. We have to be accountable. If I have a story, I must be able to stand by it with proof, whether I give my sources or not, but I really have to. That is missing. People just right now, opinion reigns as fact, and facts are completely unnecessary. As they say, why let facts come in the way of a good story? And opinion has become journalism. Mm-hmm. And that's the sad part, because people are now watching news, which is opinion, and they think they're watching news, and our propaganda, the propaganda has warped our brains so much that we don't know the difference. We don't know whether we're watching news or propaganda because it's become so blurred. Mm. So I think more than regulation, I think accountability, that when a journalist announces something on camera, he should be accountable for what he's saying. But that's missing. So are they going to regulate that? How do you regulate that? It's not possible.
Yeah, accountability is crucial. And, I always tell my team, at least, that because you have this tendency of going out there on social media and tweeting stuff much more freely than you would when you're actually doing a live broadcast, you're reporting the story. And I just tell them that the same rules apply. Use the same rules that you would use when you're doing a television broadcast or a television report that you would on social media, where sometimes people just say whatever they want to say without any fact behind it. But, to the larger issue, there's lots of questions that have come in. Harshvardhan has written in as well. And let me get Dr. Baru to start by commenting on that. We were talking about the essence of journalism, providing information, empowering people, taking on the establishment, giving the information on issues that matter, the real essence of journalism. How do you reclaim that? Because all three of you have talked about how that's not what we're seeing happen, at least on a lot of mainstream media. Without, again, sweeping generalizations, on a lot of mainstream media, we're not seeing that happen. How do you reclaim journalism? Sanjay Baru.
Well, again, let me wave the flag for print. I think print still has news. It is really in television that we have this problem of whether is this news or entertainment. And I think the questioner, I just saw his question, is asking whether television is infotainment. It is. I mean, look, what is television all about? You are sitting in front of a TV with a remote control, and you can switch channels between cinema, between soap opera, between cricket and golf and news. And so the news channels are competing with entertainment channels for viewer attention. And that warps their style. While in print, we are not competing with entertainment channels. We are not competing with, cricket magazines or the cinema magazines. Print is all about news. Print remains about news. And that is where some of the new news websites, I mentioned The Wire, I mentioned the print, these are some of the websites where you go for news apart from views. And I think, in the editorial, Madhu talked about, accountability. Accountability only comes with editorial control, because without editorial control, you do not have internal accountability, and that's where the government steps in. So I do think the problem which you mentioned, Shereen, or the questioner asked, is essentially a television problem, because television is operating in the space of entertainment, while print still operates in the space of news.
James, do you believe that the answer to this business of actually making news more relevant to the viewer, to the consumer, is going hyper-local? Sanjay was talking about how vernacular press continues to do much better than the Indian language, than the English press. Is the answer then to create niche and more niche brands so that people know exactly what they're going for and who they're going to?
Yes and no. So outside of India, you certainly do see this trend that the struggling kind of mid-tier American newspapers, for instance, the ones that haven't been able to kind of catch the wave that the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, they have gone in this hyper-local direction. And they end up being pretty parochial, to be honest. So the type of news that they're covering is very local, but it's not as if that they're doing a huge amount of local investigative journalism. They simply tend to do low value local stories and not do the things that they used to do, like foreign reporting or investigative journalism. So, I mean, I think this is a hellishly difficult problem. To some degree, I think part of the answer to this has to come from philanthropy. That's been true in other media markets where you see large donors try and set up new kinds of public service media institutions, things like ProPublica. There's a whole range of these kind of things who try to do partnership-based journalism. I mean, I think, to be honest, some of this has to come down to rich people. If you look at the success stories across other parts of global media, from the South China Morning Post to the Washington Post, often unfortunately, this much public service media is a kind of loss-making endeavor, and you require benign rich people to come along and fund these things, as opposed to kind of non-benign rich people. And so I think, given I have some heritage of writing about your country's super rich, then some of these super rich people should, those who are sort of slightly more public spirited in their bent, should open their pocketbooks and find a way of supporting some of these important public service institutions. And then I suppose you know, to another degree, you have to kind of put your faith in innovations. And if you look at something like, I don't know, the rise of TikTok and some of the new media platforms, you have to hope that coming out of that, there are innovations that will be beneficial from a news point of view. But it's actually hard to see that. I mean, I don't see too many examples of that happening outside of India. And in fact, the older I've become, the more I have sort of come to realize the value of the old established institutions, be they broadcasters like the BBC or the heritage print newspapers, because they're the ones that do the investigative journalism. They have the resources to pay, you know, people reasonably well. And so making sure that you guard those institutions that you have, the ones that Sanjaya was talking about, is also particularly important. So.
Yeah, Madhu, do you believe that we'll have enough benign philanthropists in India to be able to support public service journalism?
We've lost her. We've
lost Madhu. Sanjay, do you think that that's something that you would look forward to?
You are getting that. You know, a lot of the new media platforms are funded by individuals. I mean, Nandan and Rohini Nilekani have been funding some of these media platforms. So you are getting some of these, wealthy Indians funding, media organizations. But you had earlier talked about local media versus national. Indian vernacular is not local; it is actually national. I mean, Dainik Jagran, Dainik Bhaskar are all India. They have a large number of states. And many of the Indian language papers, particularly in Bengal, in Kerala, in Andhra Pradesh, in Tamil Nadu, where the literacy rates are very high, they are actually very important medium for news. Their focus is not only local, their focus is national as well as international. So I do think that we need to pay more attention to what is happening in Indian language media, to be able to take a view on problems of either professionalism or credibility or accountability.
Well, we've got a few questions coming in. Luis Miranda sending us a question. Since Sanjay just answered, I'll get James to address that. Can you comment on the role of social media in India, the huge IT cell networks run by political parties to shape opinion? James.
I said this at the beginning. This is one of the big problems, and it's not just limited to India. That a whole range of different countries across Asia that I cover are really struggling with how you take this new layer of social media on countries that have sharp existing divisions of ethnicity, of class, caste, however you want to divide it. And almost everywhere, this has been very problematic. So, I mean, India is an example of a much broader trend, and the political parties know this. What you do about this, I mean, in a sense, the only thing I think you can do about this is lean on the platforms themselves. It's very, very hard to do this in any other way. So one of the few things that has made kind of social media slightly less poisonous over the last few years has been WhatsApp voluntarily reducing its own virality. So the rule that says that you can only send your forwards to 5 people, that was much more effective than anything else at stopping the spread of fake news or stopping the spread of kind of politically motivated, the kind of things that are either developed by the IT cells or which emerge spontaneously from groups of extremists or people who are intolerant of others. And so I tend to think that if you're going to try and solve this problem, and it is a problem that needs solving, as in how do you take the benefits of these social media platforms, which have provided voices often to people who don't have voices. They give communication tools to hundreds of millions of people who didn't have them before. And so in many ways are positive, and we wouldn't want to do without them. But how do you keep that while trying to tamp down on some of the worst excesses of the platforms? And I think you have to do that at the level of the platform architecture itself. It's extremely difficult to do it with the kind of post hoc regulation or legal interventions that would have worked in the print media ecosystem, simply because of the speed at which these things operate.
Yeah. Dr. Madhu, there's a question that's coming from Manish Shah, and he says that editors staying in an AC house, going in an AC car to an AC office are often not in touch with reality. Is that why they get the election outcomes wrong?
Oh, come on, election outcomes. I think I don't want to get into the question of election outcomes. These are all psephologists who do their statistics. But, the fact is that it's not correct to imagine that editors live in ivory towers in their AC offices and AC cars. I think we have a lot of professionals, good professionals. Let me say this in defense of Indian journalists. There are a lot of them have a very good understanding of what is happening in this country. I mean, you take my favorite newspaper every morning is the Indian Express, which I think has excellent understanding of what is happening in the country. And there are many other newspapers which are very well grounded in the reality of our country. And so I don't think it's true that the print media or mainstream media is disconnected from the Indian reality.
Okay. James, there's a question for you. Shantanu Ambedkar writes in saying, don't you think ownership of media by super rich individuals actually perpetuates a bias rather than principled reporting?
Yeah, I agree. That's the risk. It's a perfectly reasonable question. It's just that it tends to be a kind of feature, not a bug, of the media ecosystem. That you could have your media owned by rich people. You can have it owned by companies, independent companies. In some countries, you can have it owned by bodies that are linked to the state. That's true in countries like Italy, also to some degree here in Singapore. And in a sense, most media ecosystems are a mixture of these things. So yes, I mean, there's no perfect outcome to this. If your media to some degree is in a financial crisis, then you've got to be phlegmatic, I think, about where the support comes from. And so if you look at something like the Washington Post, so the Washington Post was bought by Jeff Bezos of Amazon. I mean, he's richer than God. He's got an ungodly amount of power. And yet he has done pretty good things for that newspaper. The same would be true of the Los Angeles Times. To some degree, I mentioned the South China Morning Post, which was bought by Jack Ma of Alibaba. We'll see, in a sense, what effect that has for completely different reasons to do with the kind of political slant of a Chinese owner of a once independent Hong Kong newspaper. But I think, in the end, it's any port in a storm. And so, if Azim Premji decides to come along and buy a newspaper, and Azim Premji is seen to be generally a kind of public-spirited individual who isn't going to a kind of asset strip or turn the media organization in a particular direction or use it for nefarious corporate purposes, then to be honest, I think that's probably better than nothing.
Well, somebody wrote in asking if you thought the Tatas owning a media company was a good idea, James. And well, you've used the Premji example. Do you think the Tatas would be a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I don't think the idea of necessarily, if it was sort of, if you were having media organizations funded by the Tata Trusts, for instance, then that would be the kind of thing that I think would be much more positive. I mean, I think Madhu mentioned this. There's certainly something rather problematic about both the influence that Reliance has over the Indian media ecosystem in general, and how much more vast that is going to get given the empire that they're building, but also what Sanjaya said, that at the local and language press level, that typically the newspapers are owned by, you know, whoever the kind of local bigwig is in Nagpur, or, you know, the old industrial family. And so these can be quite problematic relationships. But as I say, I was talking more about, you know, how can you rescue this public service tradition, and in a sense you take what you can get.
Well, you know, we've done about an hour. That was our budgeted time. We've tried to address many of these complex issues. It's not going to be dealt with in 60 minutes. These are issues that, from rescuing and reclaiming journalism to regulation, this is stuff that requires us to sort of sink our teeth into it and continue to have this conversation and really have a dialogue about what it will take to stay relevant to our viewers and to our consumers. But James Crabtree, Sanjay Baru, and Madhu, who we lost in the middle. But thanks very much for joining us, and thanks very much for your time, as well as for your insights on what the road ahead looks like.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shereen. Thank you. If Sanjay, James, Madhu, I hope, Madhu, you can still hear us, and can you? Yeah, poor Madhu is trying to sort of speak. But if you can put your iPods on, Madhu, you can still get a word or two. Anyway, Madhu, your expression says it all. You're animated. No, unfortunately not, Madhu. We are going to sort of, but nonetheless, I think it's been an absolutely riveting debate. For somebody who's come from a regulated environment, I can see how journalists react to regulation and any kind of boundaries or parameters that are put across the fourth pillar. But the fact is that there is good journalism, and there is also journalism that is being questioned. And if we need to sort of develop a journalistic structure that seems reasonably good and viewers believe in the credibility that is going to be there, so I think it makes sense that we see as to what is, whether it's self-regulation or it is good accountability. But all of this would be truly important for us to take a look at as to how this evolves. And I do hope that whatever happens from here on as to whether the regulatory framework is good, bad, ugly, but the dynamism of Indian journalism continues to be there and the credibility stays. To all my panelists and to Shereen, many thanks for this wonderful session. Thank you so much.